Hello, my name is TJ Larkin, and this is video number 4 in the sequence of videos we've done about procedures. I'm going to show you the 4 videos we've done. Video number 1 was about corporate procedures, standards, policies, and what it did is it showed what was communication best practice. Video number 2 was also about corporate procedures, and it argued that the 2 most important things to do when you're improving the communication of your procedures or standards is to make sure you get a rewrite, not an edit, and custom illustrations, and not clip art. Video number 3 was about business unit procedures, not the corporate level, but now at the business unit. And it argues that there's too many of those. There's too many business unit procedures, and you don't really have the skills at the business unit level to take those and turn all of them into communication best practice. But there are still many important things you could do to improve your business unit procedures, and they're easy enough that the business units could do those themselves, and they're valuable and they're worth doing, and I discussed that, showed a bunch of samples in video number 3. This is the last video in the sequence, and it's video number 4. It's really kind of a bonus video, and it doesn't follow, really from the previous 3. This one is really meant for you and for logging into this video, and it gives 3 things you can do to improve your writing. And it doesn't improve your writing a little, it improves your writing a huge amount. So what's the motivation for this? I'll just tell you a quick story. I was given a presentation 2 or 3 years ago at the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, and I was sitting in the audience. I was waiting for my turn to speak. I was the next speaker coming up. And there was a woman sitting beside me, and she kind of turned to me in some frustration and said to me, I wish you could come to one of these conferences and learn something that you could use immediately. She said, learn something I could go, when I get back to the office on Monday, I could just start doing that. And it would be a valuable change. And I thought that was a reasonable request. And I looked down at my notes. I was the next speaker, and I thought, well, there's some good material here, but could you use this immediately, like Monday morning? Could you leave this conference and just start doing these things? And it stuck in my head. And particularly in the field of communication, there are some things that I can tell you that will dramatically improve your writing, and you can just do them immediately. And it's not like they're hard. They're not hard, they're just simple, they're easy. And so that's what this video is about. I'm going to give you 3 things you can do that would just, make your writing much better. Here are the 3 things. You should be using Verdana font for like 90% of everything you do, and occasionally Georgia as a font, and I'll describe why it's important to use those 2. You need a 3.5-inch line length. Most of you are using a 5, 6, 7-inch line length, and that's a serious mistake. You need to stop doing that. You need to limit your line lengths to 3.5 inches. And I don't care what you're writing, if you're writing policies, procedures, if you're writing emails, if you're writing brochures, if you're writing reports, 3.5 inches, I'll show you why this is so critical during this presentation. And at the end of the day, what I think most people don't understand is that paragraphs are dead. People wrote like that in the 1800s. There's no, it's just gone, man. You don't want to be writing paragraphs. The problem is most of you learn to write from, somebody who was an English major, and, they were in love with novels. And yeah, I'm kind of making fun of it. I'm kind of not making fun of it. I get it. I get it. But no, that's not what we're doing in big companies today. It's not helpful. And I'm going to show you why you don't want to write paragraphs anymore. You want to break them out into dot points or into lists, or at least into indentations. And I'll show you those. These are the 3 things you do. If you did these 3 things, you'd have hundreds of % improvement in your writing. Let's start with fonts. You should be using Verdana 95% of the time. Why? Verdana is actually a relatively new font. It was invented in, I think, 1998, and it was invented by Microsoft. And it was specifically invented by Microsoft because people were spending more and more time reading on their computer. They were reading text off their monitor. And what Microsoft understood is that the vast majority of fonts that are in that list of fonts you can choose from were really created during and intended for printing onto paper by, through a printing process. And a normal printing process will have 1200, 1800, DPI, dots per inch. You can handle really fine resolution and great detail. Your computer monitor is more like 70, 80, 90 DPI, and it really can't handle the precision of most fonts. So Microsoft sat down and made a brand new font. They did a pretty good job with it. What did they know? What did the creator of the font knew? Well, what they knew was that the primary way that readers recognize letters is through here, through the empty hole that's right there. That's called a counter. It just slipped my mind for a minute. Sorry. It's called a counter. What's a counter? A counter is the white space that's defined by the surrounding black stroke. And what your eye does is it searches for counters and it uses those to determine what the letters are and then to build the word. And what Microsoft did in the Verdana font was to increase the size of these counters. They actually increased the whole size of the letter, but more importantly, they increased the size of the counter. So if you look at the counter here at this E, that's the white space defined by the black line. And then look at the white space here, this counter, you'll see that this is a pretty noticeable difference. And it's just going to make the letters easier to read. And similar to this point, this also explains why you don't want to use much bold. You might occasionally use bold for emphasis, but you don't really ever want to write a sentence in bold because bold's really hard to read. Well, why is bold hard to read? Bold's hard to read because what bold does is increase the size of the stroke, stealing space from the counter. And that's the exact opposite of what you want. You want the counter to be as large as possible and a thinner stroke. And so when you use bold, I'm not saying never use bold because you might use it purely for emphasis purposes, but you need to understand why people don't use much bold because bold is much harder to read. And the reason it's hard to read is because the counters are disappearing. Let me just give you one more tip as long as I'm here. You don't want to use all caps either. All caps destroy the word shape, the shape of the word. Okay, here's the word geography. And what I've done here is outline the shape of this word. And over the course of many, many years of reading, your body, your brain eventually starts to recognize the shape of a word. And that quickly tells it which word it is because these words all have different shapes. If you use all caps, there's no shape, right? Everything fits in the box, touches the top line, touches the bottom line. There's no shape. And when there's no shape, it's just much harder to read. So you don't want to use bold, you don't want to use all caps, you do want to use Verdana, and very occasionally you want to use Georgia. Now, when Microsoft made Verdana, 1998, they also went ahead and made Georgia because they knew they needed a serif font. Serif is Latin for tail. And these letters have what we call a tail on them at the end of the stroke. And a sans serif font without tail, they don't have that. Now, a sans serif font, which is Verdana, is quite a bit easier to read, especially on a computer. It's quite a bit easier to read. Well, why would Microsoft go to all the trouble of making a font that's harder to read than Verdana? And they obviously felt it was necessary to make it. And they're right, it isn't necessary to make it. Well, why is that the case? That's the case because text that's written in a serif font like Georgia is perceived by readers as the content being more credible. So in the studies we do, you can have the content being exactly the same. All right, the words are all exactly the same. One's in Verdana font, one's in Georgia font. The one that's in Georgia font will be rated as a more credible piece of work. They'll say that the author knew the material better. They'll say that it made more sense, that it was more reasonable, that it was better backed by evidence. All the words are exactly the same. So why did they make those claims? They made those claims because the font influenced their view of the credibility of the text. And well, why did that happen? Yeah, I'm going to tell you the story. Why a serif font has more credibility than a non-serif font. I just want to tell you, I've got a little team. My little team is here in the office, and they're all shaking their head. You know, we had a meeting before I did this, and they were like, "Oh, TJ, don't do that professor thing you do. You know, like just just tell people they can use Verdana, and sometimes they can use Georgia, but you don't go into all that professor stuff." Well, I don't care. They can roll their eyes at me. I'm just going to do this anyway because I find it really interesting, and I think you're going to find it interesting. So I'm just going to put my head down and go through this thing. Why do serif fonts have greater credibility than non-serif fonts? Well, the reason why is because when all of you went to school, if you're any age older than, let's say, 20, so 25, maybe 20, if you're any age older than that, you went to school and what the teacher gave you were textbooks, right? Your physics textbook, your history textbook, whatever. And all of those textbooks were written in a serif font, similar to Georgia. And so your brain began to associate at a very young age that material that's sort of authoritative and accurate and true, it has this font to it. Now, here's the part I find really interesting. Well, why did they write textbooks in serif fonts? Well, the reason they wrote textbooks in serif fonts was because the Bible, this is the first Bible printed by Gutenberg, 1455, it used a serif font. Okay, the letters look almost exactly like these. And Bibles were always written in serif font. So when they started to think about, well, what's the best font to use for a textbook, they thought to themselves, well, what's the most credible book out there? And guess what? That was the Bible. And so they said, let's do that, right? Whatever font's in the Bible, let's do that in our textbooks. So this view of a serif font being highly credible is deeply ingrained. You know, we got like maybe 600 years of that association going on. Well, I'm going to do one more thing, and then I'll get back to being a little bit more practical. But I can't control myself. Why is the Bible written in a font that looks like that? Why is the Bible written in a serif font? The reason the Bible is in a serif font is because these Europeans really admired the Greeks and the Romans. And if you look at engravings of text in Greek and Roman buildings or in Greek and Roman tablets, they are a serif font. And so when they went to write the Bible, they said, we're going to do this in the same style of font that we see in Greek and Roman buildings in the text engraved in Greek and Roman buildings. Well, why is that text in a serif font? Why is the text in Greek and Roman buildings in a serif font? Well, this is like a really cool thing, I think. Those engravers that engraved the text into the building, they were illiterate. They couldn't read nor write. They just engrave, right? So they got a chisel and a hammer, and they're going to chisel this thing in. So when there was writing to be put on the building, they went and got the scribes, and the scribes came out with like a big bucket of black paint and a paintbrush, and they would dip that brush into the paint, and these were pretty big letters on the sides of buildings, and then they would draw the text. They would draw the words. Now look at this. Look at the way this A starts. That's what happens when you take a paintbrush and you touch it and hold it. You get a blob. And then as you move that brush around, you get a brush stroke. So it's thinner here and thicker here. And you're getting a paintbrush stroke throughout that letter. And then once that paint book was on there, they then engraved the letter in that shape. And that's where these serif fonts come from. So they came from the Greek and Roman buildings. They made their way into the Bible. They made their way into your textbook. And now they made their way into your brain. So that when you see a serif font, you're more likely to believe it's true. I think textbooks now for kids are coming on iPads. I don't know. I doubt they use a serif font for that. So that's probably the end of this. But if you're older than 20 or 25 or something, this is going to work for you. It works enough that Microsoft went to all the trouble to not just make Verdana, but to make Georgia as well. Now, Verdana is definitely easier to read than Georgia, and they know that. But they also knew they needed a font, which was the serif font. And so 99% of the time, you're going to be using Verdana. You should be using Verdana. And occasionally, when you're trying to maximize credibility, you want to go ahead and use Georgia. So that's the Verdana font. Now, the second thing you want to do is the 3.5-inch line. This is like 1.5 inches, 2 inches. Try to read it. This block right here. It's hard to read. It's awkward. The line length is too short. This line length is too long. But the problem is not so much in the reading. You can read a long line of text without too much problem. This problem is actually in the length is too short. This problem you can kind of read. I'll go back and explain to you in a minute why this is the case. The hard part in this long text is going back to the beginning and finding the next line. Because you got to go back so far that you lose track of where you're at. Now, if you just read the first line, you're gonna go, your eyes are gonna go back and catch the second line pretty good. But when there's 8, 9, 10 lines here, and you're into line 4 or 5 or 6, and then you go back, you're gonna find yourself reading the same line over again. You're gonna find yourself skipping a line because the line length is too long and it's too hard to do the return. So what's the ideal line length? It's here. This is about 3.5 inches. And I'm going to explain in a minute why that's really the ideal line length. This is Wikipedia. Hey, so you need to call these people on the phone and tell them your line length is too long. You kidding me? I don't know why they do that. I'm a big, I really like Wikipedia. I use it a lot, but somebody's got to let these people know that this is like a really long line length. And you read this first one, you're going to be okay. You read the second one, you're going to be okay. As you get into this thing into here, you're like, damn, you're like really working hard to find out where the line is. And that's because the return is too long. So how do people read? We know how people read because we have what they call eye cameras. And they will shine a near infrared light, which will go into your eye and it'll reflect and it'll come back out the pupil and it'll be on a photosensitive cell, which will tell us your gaze path, where you start looking, where you move, and how your eyes move. And what we've known actually for quite a long time is that the eye reads in what they call saccades and fixations. And really, those are just two fancy words for sweeps and stops. So your eye doesn't read smoothly across the line. It reads a bit and it stops. And it seems like that information is then like discharged in some sort of cognitive processing mechanism. And then you sweep again, sweep up another bunch of words and stop. And then that gets cognitively processed. And then you move again and stop. So it's this sweeping and stopping is how people read. And we know that because we do this through the eye camera. I'll tell you one other short thing I find really kind of cool is we've known this since like the 50s. And how did they do that before they had eye cameras? Well, what they did is they took a book. That's the center spine. And they had all the lines here. And on this side, they put a mirror. And then they would try to do videotape filming of the mirror. And that's how they realized, oh man, people are not like just smoothly going down the line. They're going in sweeps and stops, sweeps and stops. So if you go back here, this is too short. This cuts the sweep off before it was finished. That's why this is awkward. This line isn't long enough. You know, you've got a comfortable sweep, and this is too short to do that. Here, the sweeps are fine because you can stop and sweep, and you can stop and sweep, and you can stop and sweep, okay? No, fine. Here's the returns the problem. Here, this is basically 3.5 inches is for most readers kind of 2 sweeps. People vary a bit, but it's kind of a sweep and then a second sweep. And the line is still short enough that the return is not hard. So it doesn't interrupt the sweeps and it's got a short return. That's why you want to be doing a 3.5-inch line length. And there's a lot of studies that show this works. You know, it's going to improve comprehension right off the top by about 20% when you go to the 3.5-inch line length. And even beside the data, yeah, let me do this. You know, we'll do our own little study here. Okay, this is a procedure. Crane rigging and lifting. What's that? Maybe 6.5, 7-inch line length. There it is at 3.5. Let me show you again. There's 6, 7. There's 3.5. So you can increase comprehension immediately by 20%. You're going to increase all this white space, which makes it much more likely that someone's going to read your document. People don't want documents that are full of black ink on them. They want documents that look like, that minimize the black ink compared to the white space. What I find really interesting about these studies is that when we ask people, well, what did you think of the writing? Not what did you think of the layout or the line length or anything, which is what did you think of the writing? Did this seem well written to you? People will tell you this was much better written. It isn't better written. It's the exact same text. It's just reducing, moving to the 3.5-inch line length made it easier to read. And making it easier to read gave people the impression that it was better written. So what you want is a 3.5-inch line length, okay? We're down a font, 3.5-inch line length. And you want to kind of stop using paragraphs. I haven't written a paragraph in 1990, I suspect. I just don't write paragraphs. And I'm just going to give you one simple example here. This is just an email. I picked it up in a company I was working in. And just, let me leave you alone for a second and just read this email. Okay. Pretty much everything's wrong with it. It's written in a serif font, which is too hard to read. It should be written in Verdana. The line length is much too long. It's the whole length of the email. And then third, it's kind of a paragraph. So it violates all 3 principles. So let's take the 3 principles and let me show you what it looks like. You see what I mean? 50% more people will read text if it does not have paragraphs. If it's broken out into lists or dot points, or in this case, it's just broken out into indentations. And this is just tighter. It's in Verdana font. The writing is fewer words, and it's a 3.5-inch line length, and there's no paragraphs. Everything is a single line. So if you were to apply those 3 rules to your writing, you're going to have a very big improvement. Verdana font, 3.5-inch line length, stop writing paragraphs, writing single lines with indentations, dot points, or lists. So that's it. That's the 4th of the 4 videos. I really appreciate that you people tuned in and listened to these things and put up with me as well. And I'm grateful for that. Thank you very much, and look forward to working with you again sometime.